All right, we'll just give it a few minutes for attendees to trickle in. For those listening in, we're going to get started in just a minute. All right, well, why don't we get started? Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I'm Jonathan Bydlak. I'm the director of the governance program at the R-Mich Institute. And with me for episode 4 of Pentagon Purse Strings is my co-host, Andrew Lautz of the National Taxpayers Union. We have 2 stellar guests today who we're very fortunate to have, and looking forward to talking all about Afghanistan and the authorizations of military force. And so our first guest is Representative Peter Meyer, who I want to thank very much for being here. Rep. Meyer is a first-term congressman from Michigan's 3rd Congressional District and has very much been a leader in the effort to repeal the 2002 authorization of military force. He serves on the Homeland Security and Foreign Affairs committees and is also a veteran of the war in Iraq, where he deployed as a non-commissioned officer in 2010. After returning and completing his studies, he led relief operations for a veteran-based disaster relief operation in South Sudan, in New York City after Superstorm Sandy, and in the Philippines after Super Typhoon Yolanda. He later worked as for a conflict analysis NGO in Afghanistan, running their advisory operations in southern Afghanistan from Kandahar City, and managing a team that helped aid workers safely provide relief to the Afghan people. Representative Meyer holds an MBA from NYU and his bachelor's from Columbia. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. And I know you'll be, oh, great, perfect.
Thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you so much. Well, let's dig in, because I know your time is limited. I want to, I guess, let's just start off maybe talking a little bit about the current state of AUMFs. You know, can you maybe explain to our listeners what exactly an authorization of military force is, why it's important, and maybe a little bit about the 2002 one in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are currently 4 authorizations to the use of military force on the books. The most cited of which, and this underpins our operations in Iraq, underpins our operations against ISIS, the broader global war on terror as well. That's the 2001 authorization for the use of military force passed shortly after 9/11 to allow the US to target Al-Qaeda and associated forces. The other 3 that are on the books are most recent, the 2002 authorization for the use of military force that was to go after Saddam Hussein and threats emanating from Iraq. That has not been the sole justification for this conflict for any of our operations since roughly 2012. And then the 1991 AUMF that authorized the Gulf War to go after Saddam Hussein the first time, and the 1957 AUMF, which was actually never used, but was intended to check communist influence in Lebanon and the broader Middle East. So we have all 4 of those AUMFs. They're currently there's currently a bill that should be heading to the floor soon, sponsored by Representative Barbara Lee, that will be focusing on repealing the 2002 authorization for the use of military force. And I've also signed on as a lead code sponsor, along with Representative Spanberger, Golden, and Gallagher, to repeal not only the 02, but also the 91 and the 57. So we're in the midst of a broader effort reevaluating war powers, looking to reform the 2001 AUMF, and hoping to really get that ball rolling by taking all the old defunct authorizations for the use of military force and just getting them off the books.
For sure, and thank you again for your time, Congressman. Can you would love for you to give our listeners a little bit more detail about this legislation that you're pursuing. So can you tell us a little bit more about the outdated AUMF Repeal Act, your work to reform AUMFs broadly? What exactly would these bills do, and why are they important?
Yeah, I guess just to set the broader stage, one of the big with the focus and where I think there's been a lot of discussion is how can Congress reprise its Article 1 responsibilities, on how to, that the founders gave us in terms of declaring war. Now, we haven't declared a war in, over 70 years, but that hasn't stopped, a lot of military action. After the Vietnam War, there was an effort to bring a little bit more of that control back through the War Powers Act of 1973. And unfortunately, that's been a little bit, considered almost a dead letter. Many presidents have, started the clock underneath it, but have always found ways around it. So, I think there's a broader discussion on how can Congress really take back some of that authority that the founders intended. How can we make sure that our conflicts just aren't operating off of their own momentum, but have some oversight, have some bounds. I think nobody expected the 2001 AUMF to still be in essentially its same form almost 20 years later. And it's now authorized operations in, I believe, 17, 18, 19 countries. So it's really gone beyond what that initial intent was. For the 2001 AUMF, initially against Al-Qaeda after 9/11, it's been used to go after militant groups that didn't exist on 9/11, didn't exist until years later, thinking of, Al-Shabaab in the Sahel and a number of other groups around the globe. It's also been used to go against groups that have been actively fighting Al-Qaeda. ISIS and the Nusra Front at the time were engaged in some very complex dynamics there. So the idea of associated forces has gotten stretched beyond any sense of rationality. So that's something that I think we really need to be focused on how do we make sure we're able to counter the threats that we're facing while at the same time having appropriate oversight so that our conflicts are occurring with the type of authorization and awareness that are frankly the people of this country deserve. Now, talking about the defunct AUMFs, the 02, the 91, the 57, to me, that's just constitutional hygiene, right? There's nothing too complex here. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions. I get that 2001 and 2002 are only a year apart. A lot of people conflate the two. A lot of the operations that have been undertaken in Iraq after American forces left, and I actually was in that last wave. I left in June of 2011, that last wave that were actively operating under that 02 AUMF. Anything that we've done since then, whether it was the recent airstrike under the Biden administration along the Syrian-Iraqi border against the Shia militants, or the killing of Qasem Soleimani last January, those were all authorized or justified under the Article 2 self-defense powers that the president has as commander-in-chief. So I think it's important to make that distinction that there's a lot of fear mongering that somehow repealing the 02 AUMF would tie our hands. If we had repealed it 8 years ago, it wouldn't have precluded any activity we've taken since then. But the idea of having these on the books can be highly problematic because, again, they're sitting there waiting for someone's creative interpretation to find a justification, so that a president, instead of having to go to Congress and say, here's why I think we should be deploying U.S. forces in a hostile way in this area, engaged in hostilities, instead of having to do that, can say, well, under the Eisenhower administration, we had something similar to check communists and prevent their expansion in the region. And these guys, maybe we saw a picture of one of them holding a book by Marx. So let's go ahead and use that rationale. So I think we need to be mindful that having these defunct AUMFs on the books has a risk, but offers no benefit, and at the end of the day undermines constitutional authority of Congress.
I think that's a great point, and I wonder if you could expand that a little bit. I know there's this debate between sort of repeal versus reform, and I wonder if you can maybe talk a little bit about that, and maybe even broaden. You mentioned war powers reform more broadly, and I wonder what does that look like in your ideal world? How do we? I guess what is our Congress's responsibilities, and how do we get to the point where Congress is maybe taking its proper constitutional role?
Yeah, and let me be very clear when we talk about reform. We should really only be talking about the 2001, right? That's operative. That has been used to justify operations that are ongoing today. And I'm wary of outright repeals of the 01, especially while we're currently in negotiations with the Taliban when it comes to troop withdrawal agreements in Afghanistan. I think I think we need to be thoughtful on how we go about what that looks like, and having, where I think the reforms should go is being able to compartmentalize and distinguish AUMFs based on geography, based on target, and then also having a time constraint. So there is a period after which it must be reauthorized. So again, we don't just have these authorizations staying on the books in perpetuity. I have not heard anybody make at all rational or persuasive argument on why we should not just repeal the 02, the 91, and the 57. In the 57 case, it was never used. The world has changed a lot in the past, 63 years. In the 91 case, the Gulf War is over. Saddam Hussein was removed. The Iraqi forces were pushed out of Kuwait. There were negotiations with the UN. That's done. In the 2002 case, Saddam Hussein's dead, right? Threats emanating from Iraq. I mean, if we interpret that so broadly, there's a number of ways in which I could see that being used to very bad ends, far, far, far removed from what the original intent was, which again was to check, Saddam Hussein and that broader view on weapons mass destruction. So there's no good argument to keep those on the books, right? And I strongly believe that helps narrow our focus and our energy on what is the most responsible way to engage with the 01 AUMF, and how do we make sure that we retain our ability to counter threats, while at the same time not having that threat countering just lead to this never-ending series of conflicts where congressional oversight is strongly weakened and the executive is given carte blanche.
Congressman, it goes without saying that Republican Party, Democratic Party, there are a diverse set of viewpoints in each party when it comes to these issues and war powers issues broadly. Mm-hmm. What has the response been so far from your colleagues? You mentioned that Representative Barbara Lee has been a leading force in this. Some of the names that you've mentioned are moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, more conservative Republicans have been on the side of repealing or reforming these AUMFs as well as more progressive Democrats. So, what are there any objections that you've heard from your colleagues, and if so, do they differ based on what side of the aisle folks are coming from, or what's the response been like?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the Democratic side right now, there's been kind of reflexive support for it. I think mostly because it's Democrats that have been proposing it, so Democrats don't really look at it too closely. On the Republican side, I think there's been some reflexive opposition because it's something supported by a Democrat. But those who look closely at it say there's no there, right? This is just a good thing to do. I mean, Mike Gallagher, who's one of the original co-sponsors of our 57, 91, 02 repeal effort, is about as thoughtful as it gets when it comes to our military operations overseas. Former Marine intelligence officer. He's by no means a dovish figure. I think he self-identifies as a hawk, but he recognizes that the 02 AUMF is well long past its expiration date, and there's no use in keeping it on. I think there was an initial move in the last year of the Trump administration to protect the 02 AUMF. I'm not entirely sure why. I think there may have been some convoluted rationale that it could be, used to attack Iran if we needed to. And to be clear, if the executive feels he or she needs to go to war or engage in hostilities against the nation and can't fit it into an existing AUMF, there's a really easy solution to that, apart from the Article 2, self-defense provision, is to go to Congress and ask for another AUMF, right? I mean, we're treating these things as if they're holy acts of parchment, when in reality, they're meant to be evolving documents to respond to the needs of the time. But I've had a number of colleagues who have cited, well, my I knew somebody who helped keep us safe because they deployed to Syria under the O2 AUMF. It's like, nope, they didn't. That was the 01 AUMF, right? We're talking about very different things. I get it, they're a year apart, but these are very different. And then others who maybe because the Trump administration, wanted to, not necessarily for any ideological reasons, but just for kind of more parochial, executive branch reasons, wanted to maintain that flexibility. They then defended it because Trump wanted it, and then are kind of a little bit backed into that corner. So, I mean, it's not, I really struggle to counter some of, to counter on substance, some of the disagreements, because there's just no real substantive disagreement grounds that can be found.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know we're getting, we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to maybe ask you a couple of maybe more personal questions. The first is just, how you got interested in this issue specifically. I mean, it is somewhat of a nuanced issue. I imagine that your, perhaps your experience in Iraq or dealing with relief in Afghanistan may have informed that. So I'm curious as to how that might have impacted. And I'm also curious to just kind of, you're a freshman member of Congress, I think, making a name for yourself around this issue. And so I'm interested to hear how your experience so far has sort of comported with maybe what your expectations were coming in, how it's been different, and what you've maybe found surprising. So if you want to tackle those couple questions.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely went into my Iraq deployment in 2010 with a strong sense of optimism. I left with a strong sense of pessimism, though I thought maybe my frustrations to that experience were rooted in the Iraq conflict. And then when I spent a couple of years in Afghanistan shortly thereafter, I realized that what failures I had seen in Iraq, that was not limited, right? That was a feature, not a bug, of our post 9/11 conflicts. And I really think until we start to put that onus back on members of Congress, force them to actually make decisions on whether and how to send troops off to war, and engage in hostilities. I mean, that again was one of those founders' original intents, was to have that live with the legislative branch. Until we get to that point, and it's more than easy to just weasel away from that hard decision and say, well, that's the way it's been, so that's the way it'll be, and I don't actually have to cast a vote knowing that lives may depend on it. And that was really one of the animating reasons why I wanted to run for office, is that understanding that what the government does and what the government doesn't do, people's lives hang in the balance. And you need folks in office who understand that severity, who understand those consequences. I would say one of my, I definitely didn't come in with a sense of naivete. My career has been spent in places like Kabul and Baghdad, so I'm not exactly thinking that things are going to work, seamlessly in DC. But it has been frustrating, I would say specifically on the AUMF issue, where again, I mean, the thoughtful folks who look into this with an open mind, there's really only one conclusion they walk away with. When I'm talking about the 02, 91, 57s, we should have a very robust and substantive and thoughtful discussion on 01. And yet there's some who, see where they feel like they need to cast their vote. They don't want to be in that lone minority. I've had some folks kind of gently threaten, be like, well, you realize you'll be the only Republican voting for this, or the only Republican voting against it. I kind of have to laugh. I'm like, well, what about my experience so far in the first 3 months of Congress suggests that they'll be dissuading. But it's more, the majority just don't want to be caught in the minority, right? You want to see where the movement's going, and there's kind of safety in numbers, that kind of pack herd mentality. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but sometimes it can just lead to taking positions that, again, I mean, folks struggle to elucidate or explain why they're doing what they're doing. And I said more than a few, explanations for why we shouldn't repeal the O2, but that's just factually inaccurate, right? There's no, it's factually inaccurate. So that's been, I think, a little bit frustrating, that even things that should be very low hanging end up just folks digging their heels for not great reasons. I mean, the repealing the old AUMFs, a dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporter can say Donald Trump was the first Republican to run for office on ending endless wars, and we are fulfilling part of that goal, right? This was in the America First MAGA agenda. A Democrat can say we need to bring it back to Congress because who knows, there might be another Donald Trump down the line and we don't know what they're going to do, right? This can fit into anybody's sort of rationale, but it's a bizarre thing. And I guess at the end of the day, some members of Congress just will do whatever they can to avoid a hard decision.
Well, for those of us who work in the policy education and advocacy space, you're describing a phenomenon I think that we are all too well accustomed to. So very much appreciate your leadership and your willingness to stick the principle on this issue. I think it speaks a lot to your character, and I think your future as a member of Congress. So thank you so much for your time today. Really, really, really appreciate it.
I appreciate it all. You guys have a wonderful day, and thank you so much for your leadership on this issue.
Great. Well, second half of our program, we're going to be joined by Dr. Will Ruger. Dr. Ruger is the Director of Foreign Policy at Stand Together and Director of Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. He is a foreign policy thought leader. He is a Navy veteran. He is a scholar, former tenured professor. Really can't say enough. And perhaps most recently noteworthy in September 2020, he was former President Donald Trump's nominee to be U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan. So, Dr. Ruger, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jonathan.
So, we just heard from Representative Meyer about his and others' efforts to repeal the 2002 AUMF. And so maybe we should start there and kind of get your perspective on how important you think this effort is and, what your thoughts generally about it are.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo the congressman's views on this. I mean, it's important for Congress to exercise its Article 1 powers under the Constitution. And it's not simply because it's in parchment, right? That it's something that the founders put there, but because it's wise. And again, I'm as big a fan as any to respecting the institutional constraints that our founders developed. But it's relevant for today. It's not just a piece of paper for a bygone time. It's as relevant as ever, right? It's the idea that you would want to have the small r Republican wisdom of the many, right? That when it comes to grave decisions about whether we go to war or stay at war or we're at peace, that the people's representatives should have a say in that, and that because they're the ones that will bear the burden, right? I mean, it's easy to think about the fact that you could really have a situation where essentially you have an executive branch, a body of one, essentially, right? You could have a decider who makes decisions that really haven't been socialized among the American public. It hasn't had its representatives weigh in on. And I think that's really antagonistic to the constitutional design. It's an antagonistic to good policy and kind of a prudential way of going about war making and peacemaking, particularly because of the fact that a conflict or a series of military operations that have been approved by the people's representatives will have more support and will have gained the ability for Congress to deliberate around it and to continue to deliberate around that even after a war has been going on. And for us, when it comes to 2002, right, we're seeing a war that's nearly 2 decades old. And the question is this AUMF relevant? Should it be something that is essentially a toolkit that could be used for mischief, executive mischief, no matter who's in office, right? This isn't a Republican or a Democrat thing. It's an issue of, as the representative said, constitutional hygiene, but also making sure that there is a consensus among the leaders of our country for the ways we're using America's military forces and the authorizations for them.
Dr. Ruger, I want to sort of hone in on one point you made. The fact that we've been there for 20 years now. I think no one 20 years ago expected us to still have a presence there today. What are the reasons it's been so hard for us to leave Afghanistan? If you could give our listeners a sense.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's Afghanistan, which is operating under the 2001 AUMF, or it's Iraq under 2002. Or any number of places and conflicts that the United States military is engaged in under dubious authorization. The fact is it's been hard for America to give up on this drug, if you will, which is the global war on terror and everything that has followed from that. And I know we don't use that term anymore, but the fact is that for 20 years, we've been addicted to a vision of America's role in the Middle East and globally that is simply archaic, I think. And I think the reason for that is because there's a mindset among foreign policy elites and among Washington, policy and policymakers, that the United States has to be engaged in this way for America to be safe or for the conditions of our prosperity to be met. But I think there is a long string of dubious assumptions, bad hypotheses about the nature of the world, and frankly, an unwillingness to look at right in the shining brightness of the lamp of experience here over the last 20 years. And again, I think that, just like I think a lot of people, in fact, almost everyone, right? The war in Afghanistan in 2001 was justified. And what we had to do in Afghanistan, which was to attrit Al-Qaeda, decimated as Secretary Panetta said, to kill or capture Osama bin Laden, and to punish the Taliban for its state support for Al-Qaeda, we needed to do that. And fortunately, we had an authorization for the use of military force in 2001. But the question really around Afghanistan is it wise to continue, especially since we expanded the number of war aims? We overloaded, this set of ends that we wanted to accomplish there, such that we were doing trying to achieve way too many things, and trying to achieve things that couldn't really be realized given any kind of legitimate cost-benefit analysis. Some things would have just been too costly to achieve, and other things are simply impossible to achieve, given the nature of Afghanistan, the nature of the United States, the nature of the world as it is. And I think that's really what the realism and restraint community brings to the table, is looking at these things pretty squarely and saying, what can we achieve? What do we need to achieve? What is good but kind of nice to have versus need to have, and what is merely impossible? And I think that's what a kind of prudential, realistic approach to foreign policy could do in a place like Afghanistan. But instead, we have an anti-realist approach. And that's, I think, the biggest thing. I think it's the set of ideas that are driving us to continue, as well as the fact that things like the sunk cost fallacy, the interests of those who have been perpetuating this conflict, they don't necessarily want to see this end in a way that is short of where they said we could go. But really, I think it's the idea set that is most problematic here. And I think we need to change that.
I think that's a great point. Then maybe let's turn a little bit to kind of where we are now and where we're going. I think our listeners are aware of the May 1st deadline. And, maybe you can kind of give us a sense of what the current state on the ground is. What do you think? Obviously the Trump administration, had negotiated for us to be out of Afghanistan by May 1st. There has been talk from the Biden administration about potentially going and pushing that deadline back. By how much, we don't know. We do know that President Biden did say he didn't foresee us being there by the end of this year. So, that would suggest that any sort of delay would be on the shorter end of the spectrum. But I'm curious as to what you think, we're likely to see. Or do you think that, what do you think the odds are that we hold to that May 1st deadline? If there is an extension, how long do you think it will be? And maybe just talk a little bit too about, the run up to how we settled on this date, why May 1st was kind of the deadline that we agreed on.
I would start by saying that it's just really unfortunate the situation we're in, where leaders, whether President Biden or others, are talking about how we have to have a logistical extension because we don't have enough time to responsibly withdraw based on the withdrawal deal that we, the United States, did sign with the Taliban. Because this is not something that we didn't know about yesterday, right? We have had over a year to be prepared to leave Afghanistan based on this deal, to leave Afghanistan fully by May 1st. And so there's really no excuse for a logistical extension that couldn't have been anticipated before this. And of course, now we are where we are. But I think we really need to make sure that there's an accountability here. For one thing, I don't think the Pentagon was acting responsibly. And second of all, I think that the Biden administration dithered. And again, part of that is they believed, I think there were different currents in the administration about whether it was a wise policy to withdraw, but there was also, I think, a concern about whether not withdrawing was actually in our interests either. And so I think that they dithered. They should have been, I think, a little bit more speedy in its decision. And now they're stuck with a situation where, they're trying to find an avenue by which I think that they can extend and hopefully, if their word is correct on this, use the time to logistically to have a responsible logistics solution to the withdrawal as it is. But again, I would say that it was a big mistake to delay to this point. In terms of the withdrawal deal, I mean, I think that Ambassador Khalilzad and President Trump, the Trump administration, deserves a lot of credit. It's very difficult for politicians to end a war. And we saw that with Vietnam, about how long it took for the United States to actually get out of Vietnam, long after political leaders knew that this was not the right war for the United States and that we were not going to be able to accomplish the goals that were set out, and that it was, to kind of use the phrase that we saw from Afghanistan or heard from Afghanistan, there was only the opportunity for a modicum of success in places like Vietnam and Afghanistan, and maybe not even that. And so I think that the fact that President Trump was able to show that courage to find a responsible, honorable way for us to leave, I think he should be credited with. And Ambassador Khalilzad, for under a very tough set of constraints, was able to conclude that deal. And one of the big constraints, you talk about the situation on the ground, is that, look, the United States, the balance of will, the balance of interest between the United States and the Taliban doesn't favor the United States. Afghanistan is just not that strategically crucial to the United States' safety or prosperity. The one thing that we need when it comes to Afghanistan is, like any other place on the globe, that it's not a place where transnational terrorists with the intent and capability to harm the United States could operate with impunity. But the fact is that, there's many places other than Afghanistan where that could happen. You don't need to have this. There's a safe haven myth, I think, out there. And it's in the Taliban and any other government of Afghanistan to make sure that that doesn't happen. It's in their interest because they don't want to face the punishment that they've suffered over the last 20 years. And again, that's why the American military, I think, should be credited with a lot of success, right? United States military, the Navy, killed Osama bin Laden. We punished the Taliban severely. They have suffered greatly over the last 2 decades. And the fact is that Al-Qaeda has been decimated there. But we accomplished that long ago. And so we could safely withdraw, use over-the-horizon capabilities, use cooperation with other countries, using our intelligence capabilities to make sure that the one thing we need doesn't emanate from there or from any other place on the planet. And that's something we forget, is that Afghanistan isn't the locus of international terrorism writ large. We need to be looking at the world more broadly and not be focusing too much energy on any one particular place, especially since the expanded war aims aren't directly connected to that, right? So making sure that we have educational access in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, give me the theory that really makes sense for how that's the thing that's going to keep Al-Qaeda from attacking the United States in the future. I just think it's a bad theory of the case.
So I do have a follow-up, Dr. Ruger. Before I ask it, just want to note for anyone listening, we do have a Q&A feature at the bottom bar of your Zoom page. If you have questions for us, for Dr. Ruger, please ask them, and we'll try to get to them before the end of our conversation. So, Dr. Ruger, I kind of want to turn to how we communicate about these issues. Jonathan and I, as advocates for our organization, we spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm sure you do too. Obviously, the message on any given issue, but especially on an issue as complex as America's presence in Afghanistan, there are different ways to communicate these issues and what's at stake to different audiences. So, are there particular arguments that you find effective with right of center audiences? And then, when you're talking to Democratic or progressive friends and advocates on this issue? Is that message different? Or, and this is sort of a related question, are there messages that are sort of unifying messages for audiences across the ideological spectrum?
Look, I spent a lot of my career trying to avoid coming to Washington. I'm an academic by training, and I think that conversations about messaging make me a little bit uneasy. I think that the best way to talk to the American public and to leaders is to be square with them, right? And to say things that are true, that will, I think, point out the kind of nature of our interests. What is the situation? What are the costs? What are the benefits? And I think that one way to talk about it that is both true and I think is helpful in the conversation is to say what I said before. The United States didn't lose the war we needed to fight and win. We accomplished that. Like I said, we met those 3 goals. Except what we did is we expanded the war aims well beyond not only what we need, but what anybody would have gone to war in the first place doing, right? If you had asked the American public and been square with them and said, hey, we're liberals, we believe in the broadest sense, classical liberals, modern liberals, we believe in the empowerment of women, which I do too here in the United States. I think that we need to recognize and we need to make sure that we treat women with the same dignity we treat men, right? We believe all that, but no one would have thought we would send thousands of troops halfway around the world to fight a war that has lasted for 20 years for the goal of educational access, right? That's just not in the cards for what we could accomplish or what we need to accomplish. And there are better ways to try to accomplish that. So we could work, NGOs can work to build sustainable change, education, diplomacy. These are the tools to hopefully convince other people of the virtues of a free society, the virtues of female empowerment, right? Those are the things that I think will last longer. So I would just be square with the American public and say, what should we be willing to sacrifice your kids' lives for? And I think most people would say, look, not this. There are other ways to do that are better. So that's an important thing. I think for conservatives, though, I mean, obviously the issue of a kind of realism about what can be accomplished. I mean, the same kind of criticisms that neoconservatives brought to domestic politics in the 60s and 70s should be the same types of arguments we should be making about our foreign policies, right? We cannot accept what, as Thomas Sowell talked about it, the unconstrained vision of humanity. We have to accept the limits, the constraints of the world as it is, human nature, the limitations imposed by political communities and their desire to be independent, right? The cost-benefit analysis that you saw of those early neoconservatives. And that's a kind of irony, if you will, is that some of the same types of critiques that neoconservatives and other conservatives have given on domestic politics, they have not utilized when it comes to foreign policy, where there's been an idealism that is simply not part of our tradition as conservatives. But in terms of unifying messages, right, I think you talk about how the American public this is a 70-30 issue with the American public. Right, the people are supportive of this, and if we believe that the people of America, that the nation should have a say in how we use military power, this is a 70-30 issue. We've seen that in the polling, and so I think that's an important one. I think it's also relates to the issue of should we be spending our dollars on other priorities? And for progressives and liberals, they may want to spend on domestic projects, right? Whether it's expanding the welfare state, or building more infrastructure, or other types of priorities. For conservatives, it could be for tax relief, given the burden we face in this country, or it could be for other, kind of pivoting our foreign policy spending to higher value goals, like dealing with the rise of China. I think that's the way to think about it, is in terms of that opportunity cost. And again, like, if you're asking me about messaging, yeah, if you want to win like professors like me, use terms like opportunity cost. But I think explaining what that means, that there is a crowding out effect, even though, of course, we spend, like drunken sailors, not to impugn my fellow Navy veterans, but we spend like drunken sailors, but there's still a crowding out effect. And I think we have to look at that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm glad you pivoted to talking about the budget, which is what we typically focus on here. So I'll ask a question in a second on that. I will make one comment, which is that I think you raised something that Congressman Meyer also raised, which is just that inertia is a really the biggest force, I think, in politics in general. In my years of sort of engaging in various policy debates, I think that it's hard to sort of step out of what you're comfortable with. And so we've been in Afghanistan for 20 years. The sort of presumption is that, well, why rock the boat, right? That we know there's sort of it's that Donald Rumsfeld known knowns, in that sense, we know what we're in right now in Afghanistan, and there's always theoretically some risk from changing policy. The odds of there being some adverse outcome may be, really minor, but because of that risk aversion and sort of comfort with what I think that oftentimes, there's an unwillingness to change policy, and we see that with politicians. I mean, in the context of, I could wax on poetically about, a hesitancy to change our budgetary process, for example, and I think a lot of it just comes down to it's what we're comfortable with, so therefore we have to do things the way we've always done it.
Yeah, and let me jump in if I can. I mean, one thing that we should not be comfortable with in this country is Americans' troops being killed in a war that its leaders do not understand how to meet our desired end state, right? When they set these goals out, and they themselves have admitted, as we saw in the Afghanistan papers that the Washington Post published, that they have really no clue what to do. American troops dying for that should not be acceptable. And so that's something that we should call this out. We should be calling this out all the time, because you talk about the risk of not staying, right, of leaving. What are those risks? Well, the risks are staying, especially if the Taliban won't accept this, right, is that more Americans could be killed. And unless there is a path to actually succeeding and meeting those goals, I think that is an abdication of responsibility by our political leaders. And so I would applaud representatives like Representative Meyer, but to be bipartisan here, representatives like Ro Khanna, Barbara Lee, and others who want to look the people squarely in the face and say, we've got to change this because we don't have a path forward that is actually worth the lives of Americans. And I think that is the real shame of this, is that in order to ward off a potential blame game about some future problem that could emanate from Afghanistan, or what could happen in Afghanistan that is bad for Afghans, politicians are willing to have Americans die, admittedly at a relatively low level. But should any American die just to protect to cover the ass of politicians? I say no, and I say the Americans should not stand for this.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Let's pivot a little bit to talking about the other point you raised, which was sort of the connection to the budget as a whole. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about your thoughts on how the ongoing conflict in Afghanistan fits into the Pentagon budget picture, maybe the federal budget on an even higher level. And I guess to follow up on Andrew's question from earlier, how important or vital you see that line of reasoning, talking about the financial cost in addition to the cost of lives, when sort of talking about our continuing presence there.
Yeah, I mean, there are always trade-offs and opportunity costs, no matter what, right? And regardless of what modern monetary theory says, there's no free lunch, and at some point there is that cost. And so I think for certain audiences, obviously, talking about that is valuable. And I think you got to put it in concrete terms, like what are we potentially giving up? And I think that the defense budget is a situation in which, sure, there's things like waste, fraud, and abuse, and everybody loves to talk about that. Although, I mean, I remember in the Reagan administration, people talking about the expensive toilet seats, right? But the real problem in our budget situation is that we're asking the military to do so many things, it's going to be expensive. So we need to have a new grand strategy, right? A new vision of what are our ends, and how do we best meet them given the nature of the world and what we're willing to bear. And I think we could really achieve cost savings there without giving up any of our safety or security or prosperity, right? For example, like if we simply told our European allies that they need to bear more of the weight when it comes to the mission of NATO, then we could do less, or we could use those resources in a better way. if we simply got out of places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, supporting the conflict in Yemen, other places, right? We could save this, but we're not going to save as much money as people think until we really wrestle with the grand strategic question. And I think at that point we have to, we have to educate Americans. I think about like, okay, what should be the ends of our foreign policy? What are the best means to realize those ends? And then what are we going to do as far as like the trade-offs, right? So there are some things that we have to decide, I think collectively, we're simply not going to do. And that's responsible governance, right? And a lot of those things just frankly aren't that important, right? It's not that important to America's safety or prosperity, for example, to be policing major parts of the globe. It simply isn't. And again, part of it is it's just not necessary, and in some cases makes things worse. So I would say, though, that in Afghanistan, I don't believe that we should withdraw fully. And when I say that, I want to be careful that I'm not quoted wrong on that. We should withdraw militarily. We should have a full military withdrawal from Afghanistan. But we should stay engaged when it comes to our diplomats in terms of our financial assistance. Now, I believe we should wean the Afghan government, no matter what form it takes ahead, off of foreign assistance because it's not healthy, it's not sustainable. It breeds the corruption that has been such a bane to Afghan society. But it would be irresponsible for us to cut the funding off immediately. But we should have a project of weaning the Afghans off that in a responsible fashion, and so that Afghans can realize the best version of itself without some of those impediments, while also not having the rug pulled out from under them immediately. So I do think it's important. So there will be cost savings from us getting the U.S. military out of Afghanistan, but it won't be the kind of whole plate of financial expenditures, at least now. But we should pare those down. We should invite other countries to increase their commitments financially, especially because we do have this challenge, which is that obviously the rise of China is the most important foreign policy challenge, and that's going to take resources. But again, that's going to require more responsibility in terms of both Congress, the Pentagon, the executive branch, about how we do spend the monies that we should spend, right? Should it be more naval, air, and space forces, less Army and Marine Corps, for example? Should we be thinking about ways we can get allies to increase their anti-access area denial technologies and capabilities in a way that actually American defense contractors will make a lot of money if we do it, and it's good policy, right? So I think that there are ways in which we could pivot our budget in a responsible fashion in meeting our security needs. But one of those is absolutely reducing our military footprint in the Middle East, which will save billions of dollars.
I want to ask a follow-up about that. I think you raised some incredibly important points, Dr. Ruger, about trade-offs here, and I think sometimes for conservatives or right of center audiences that are maybe not experts on these issues, and I for one am not an expert on these issues. You are, I think there can be a gut instinct to oppose some of the more butter in the guns versus butter debate, right? So foreign assistance, even though there may be concerns about corruption in parts of the world, there are concerns about corruption in parts of the world. Diplomacy and what role do you think if we are to draw down and eventually completely withdraw our military presence in Afghanistan? What role? How do you think NGOs and U.S. assistance to Afghanistan and diplomacy? How do you think that those tools can further our interest in Afghanistan once we are completely withdrawn militarily?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have limited interest in Afghanistan when it comes to vital interests. So I want to just say that first off. But when it comes to some of the things that we as individual peoples care about, right? I think most of us would think that the world will be a better place if we're more classically liberal, right? That we follow better economic policies, corruption goes down, we respect the dignity of all people. Great, right? Those are all important things. But I would lose my conservative card if I said I knew how NGOs should engage in any kind of micro level. And I know you're not asking that, right? Like, I don't know the best way to provide eye care to Afghans. I know that there are NGOs that know better ways to do it than I do, and better ways than I think the US government knows how to do that. But in general, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of sustainable change you can have, right? Especially if it goes along with education, right? It kind of follows the, teach a man to fish as opposed to, providing, the food, right? And I think when it comes to, Afghanistan, for example, I think that, NGOs will know best how to talk to Afghans, to do so in a way that's respectful of their own kind of how they come to the table, right? That kind of the cultural, ideas that the host country has. So I think it has to be, that's going to be better. They're going to know more. I think that you don't have to be a libertarian to appreciate the Hayekian insights about local knowledge, right? And NGOs and locals are going to have that in a way that we simply can't. And I saw this. I served in Afghanistan in 2008, 2009, and I don't want to go into a lot of details of that, but I definitely saw cases where it's really clear that some major from the U.S. Army who's going to spend 270 to 350 boots on the ground days there is going to know a lot less about how to deal with some of these challenges of what was called there civil military relations, right? So essentially nation building. They're just not going to be as adept at that as people who either do this for a living in terms of they're in the private economy and they have incentives to do that, or NGOs or diplomats, right? And again, if we as conservatives thought government was good at promoting economic development, then we probably wouldn't be conservatives when it came to the role of the government in the economy, right? And so what we should try to do is, as Adam Smith talked about, they need peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. And when it comes to Afghanistan, it's the first and the third of those that are most important, right? Peace, so they need security. And that's why I hope that the Afghans will choose peace in the future. And then a tolerable administration of justice, which I take it to mean that would include, I don't know if Smith did, but it would include things like a government that can provide swift justice, right? That follows some due process, that treats people equally, that isn't corrupt, that isn't treating connected people different than unconnected people, which is a major source of grievance of Afghans, right? And that's one of the reasons why you see some Afghans turning to the Taliban, because they believe that the government is not providing equal justice to all. And so they look to others to do that. Those are the types of things that Afghanistan needs. And again, I don't think the US military is well suited to bring a lot of that, and hasn't proven to be able to bring that security, especially because ultimately, when it comes to working by, with, and through the host nation government is just not that good. And 20 years later, it's not that much better. And in many ways, it still suffers from the same problems.
Yeah, you quoted Smith, but your remarks actually reminded me of the great Hayek quote about I forget how it goes exactly, but something like the curious task of economics is to show people how little they really know about what they think they can design. And I think that's true. That sometimes when you look in the foreign policy space, there's this belief that you have to have everything perfectly figured out, as if you can just sort of put these variables into an equation and then that's going to spit out the perfect outcome. But there's always so many things that we don't know, and I think it's important that we're realistic about that.
Yeah, and for conservatives, just real quick, any conservative who thinks that we can accomplish what we've been laying out in Afghanistan for 20 years should remember that there was that arrow diagram that was on the front of the New York Times that showed like all the ways and things that you have to do. If that wasn't the poster child for anti-conservatism, right? That somehow with like 800 arrows, or how many of there were, I'm exaggerating, that somehow we could like know how to pull this lever and that lever, right? Talk about losing your conservative card, or just your sanity card for that matter. Because I don't think conservatism should have a monopoly on just like understanding foolishness when it comes to how government can effectively work. And I think that just showed you exactly what Hayek talked about in both of those cases, local knowledge and the kind of like the knowledge problem that you reference. But I would say too, like if we're thinking about kind of like the lessons of conservatism that we should be applying as conservatives, is Eric Voegelin, right? He talked about the problem of immanentizing the eschaton, which is a mouthful and not something I'd go out on the road with. But it's this idea of creating heaven on earth, right? It's, we know that can't be achieved for all the reasons that conservatism and classical liberalism have been talking about for hundreds of years. Why do we keep falling into that trap, right? And that's why I go back to how we have to change our strategic culture. Our strategic culture has to be more modest, humble, prudential, realistic, doesn't want to immanentize the eschaton, right? It has to understand that in reality, right, is that oftentimes we're able to trim the sails more than we are to turn the ship 180. And Afghanistan is simply a ship that cannot be turned 180 or even 90. We can maybe trim the sails in a way that's consistent with our interests, but there's real limitations on what can be achieved. And I think that that in a lot of ways, it's the people who think we should leave, that's realism. And the people who think that we can stay and we can fight a generational conflict and we can really achieve a kind of shift in the Afghan culture and we can change Afghanistan society in a huge way through the application of military power and a whole of government solution. I just think that's a kind of idealism that is not consistent with conservatism. And frankly, I just think it's not consistent with any kind of sensible progressivism either, because to give credit to progressives, they're not fools, right? And trying to continue to do what we're doing in Afghanistan, despite banging our head against the wall, fits that old cliche about the definition of insanity. And no sane person thinks that's sound, whether you're a conservative or otherwise.
Yeah, I think there's often a disconnect in the way that many view domestic issues from foreign policy issues, and somehow there's this presumption that things are different in the foreign policy realm. But oftentimes the same principles that you might be critical of a given domestic program, you should be critical of those programs in a sense that are taking place beyond our borders.
I mean, that's the shame of neoconservatism, like I said earlier, right? I mean, I have great respect for the first generation of neoconservatives and what they brought to the table after they were mugged by reality, right? When it came to like looking at Great Society and saying, this is insane, like we are mugged by reality. That kind of realism or conservatism on the domestic front simply has been turned upside down. And again, so I don't think it's that neoconservatives are evil. It's just that neoconservatives need to hearken back in many ways to the kind of guiding principles of their critique of domestic politics. And I think that's where you could find ideally a kind of conservative, classical, liberal fusion on foreign policy, is if we would just go back to our roots about questioning, what you talked about in terms of the kind of that or embracing rather that kind of understanding about what we don't know, understanding about the problem of the unconstrained vision of humanity, understanding that limited government isn't just because we want tax cuts, right? That's not why most of us want limited government. It's good not to have to use the fruits of your labor at the will of others, but it's also because limited government, we know, because there are limitations on government's ability to effectively realize the ends that we care about. And I think all of those relate to our foreign policy. And this is something that I share with a lot of our partners on the left of center, is a realization that oftentimes when we have even good intentions, we harm the people we're ostensibly trying to help. And I don't know if we have to finish here, but if we do, I would wrap up by saying, like, look, I know a lot of the audience that we're talking to here are conservatives, and I think that those ideas are important to bring to the table. But I think that we have a very healthy transpartisan, bipartisan coalition of people who understand that it's not good for America to continue the way we've been doing this in the Middle East in particular, but more globally. And it's not good for people that we ostensibly care about. And it doesn't connect up to what our priorities need to be at home and abroad. And I think that whether it's conservatives, liberals, progressives, or people without any kind of identification in that way, that we can come together for the solution. And we've seen it. And I will be the first to applaud President Biden, if he does the right thing on Afghanistan, does the right thing on places like Syria and Iraq, and really shifts our policy in the right direction. Because I think at the end of the day, whether we're conservatives, liberals, or progressives, we want what's best for our country here. We don't want Americans dying unless it contributes to our safety and security and is at a reasonable cost. That's not a conservative message. To me, that's just sanity.
Well, I always like to end on a positive note, and I think that for the most part accomplished that goal. So thank you very much for your perspective. Really appreciate it, Dr. Ruger. I think it's very interesting. I think there are a few issues, frankly, that are more impactful. I mean, we talk a lot of fiscal issues all the time, but there are not all of them really impact people's lives quite in the as direct a way as our foreign policy decisions do. So thank you for the work that you're doing on this, and for your thoughts, and for being with us here today. Thank you to everyone who listened in. Very much appreciate it. Hope you'll join us next month. We will be, I hope, at that point, knowing a little bit more about what the Biden administration Pentagon budget looks like, and so we're hoping to have a discussion at that point in time, talking about the Biden budget. But thank you all so much, and look forward to next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.